So this is the first of an ambitious lecture series, hopefully titled the 22 lectures on various aspects of Sri Lankan writing in English, both its historical thematic areas as well as more contemporary points of discussion. Uh, so to start off things, I think logically it will be important and informative to start off with a bit of history, trying to in some way trace the Sri Lankan English fictional tradition, the Sri Lankan English literary tradition, from its origins to the present time, and trying to in some way map the various aspects, people, and developments of this tradition within a kind of framework which we can refer to, or which we can draw from in the course of the next lectures. So uh, starting off on a historical note, there are uh, several schools of thought regarding who look at the emergence of what we can call a Sri Lankan tradition in English writing. Now, Sri Lanka, the concept itself of Sri Lanka is very new. It's a 20th century concept, the idea of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka only comes into being in the second half of the 20th century in 1972. Till 1972, the island we call Sri Lanka today, that nation state, it was called Ceylon. And then again, even Ceylon, it becomes a geographical and political entity which complements with the European concept of nation state. That emerges only after British colonization of the island in 1815. So at the outset, both the idea of Ceylon as well as the notion of Sri Lanka, though we use these in a very general, widespread sense, these are very new concepts. Definitely, these are concepts that come with colonialism, and they have to be identified within a larger colonial project, which in a way also gives rise to what we later on embrace as Sri Lankan writing in the English language. So, some of the scholars who look at the origins of the Sri Lankan English literary tradition try to trace it back to some of the colonial officers who came to Ceylon in various parts of the various points of the 19th century, settled down, and actually took to writing, and who have later published many volumes and documents that look at numerous aspects of colonial life in the island, in Ceylon. So there are some scholars who even go back to writers like William Knighton, who was writing in the 1840s and the 1850s, as early as the 1840s and the 1850s. One of his key texts is Forest Life in Ceylon. To be very honest, from a narrative perspective, some of these writings, they incorporate various aspects of what we might call the modern or the emerging novel of that time. So descriptions, for example, and also various aspects of the narrative tradition can be located. But these are writings of colonials who have emerged, settled down, who have spent long time. Now, for example, people like Major Skinner or Thomas Baker, the kind of writing they do, there's a very strong biographical element, and also an understanding of the environment they inhabit through a long term organic relation with it. But I do not personally subscribe to this tradition that tries to take Sri Lankan English writing back to the 1840s and 50s. because for me, those writings have emerged from a purpose very different from a purpose and a commitment very different from what we see in English writing that came much later, which more closely mirrors the emergence of the modern novel within the European tradition. So the second school of thought, and this is the kind of scholarship that I am more comfortable with, tries to trace the origins of the contemporary or the modern Sri Lankan English fictional tradition to Lucian De Silva, whose Dies of the Gods was published in London in 1917. Dies of the Gods has gone to subsequent editions as well between 1917 and the present. The edition I have was published in the 1940s. Now, Lucian De Silva, who was a kind of a patron, or he was interested in various arts, including poetry. He was a kind of a student of these literary expressions, literary forms as well. Was also a bit of a kind of a Renaissance guy. He was by profession a doctor, but had a broader view of arts and sciences. And the Dice of the Gods was his first publication. He also had a second publication, personally for me, one that reads better than Dice of the Gods, called The Chandala Woman. The Chandala Woman was also very recently translated into Sinhala, about 8 years after its original publication. So I think the the title itself kind of denotes the subject matter, the Chandala woman. So there is a class and caste interest in that second novel, which is in a way a bit similar to some of the interests that can be seen in the writing projects undertaken by some of these early writers. Several other names that follow from Lucian De Silva include writers like S.J.K. Crowther, who in 1928 published The Knight Errant, which is a satirical novel, I would say a satirical novel, looking at various aspects of Ceylon changing through the times, from the 19th to the early 20th to his time in the late 1920s. 1928 is also the year Rosalind Mendes, a very notable female writer at the time, published a short novel called The History of a Tragedy. The History of a Tragedy. Rosalind Mendes also published several other work. A few names that come to mind include Nandimitra, which was published in 1952, and also My Son Leah and Other Stories in 1975. Now, Rosalind Mendes is a very good case study to understand the infrequency of the English publications that were emerging at the time. So people were writing in English, true, but the frequency of publication was sparse. There was no momentum to writing in English as a cohesive project per se. So in Mendis's case, The History of a Tragedy comes in 1928, Nandimitra in 1952, so there's a 24-year gap there, and My Son Leah and Other Stories, another 23-year gap. So these are three works that come in the expanse of 47 years. So the same can be kind of applied to understanding the larger picture of publications. So Lucian De Silva, Dies of the Gods 1917, Crowther 1928. These are some of the notable works at the time. Then there's a writer H.E. Veerasurya, or Herbert Veerasurya, who publishes a novel called The Trousered Harijan, 1946, if I remember right, 46 or 47, mid to late 1940s. And he publishes another novel, much later in life, actually in 2000, called Mud Hut to Mansion. A very interesting novel, which kind of takes us through a series of changes in Sri Lankan life from the time of independence to the turn of the century. So there is again an interest in caste, class, social change, and so on. The kind of concerns Veerasuriya has in the Trousered Harijan, as does Crowther in the Knight Errant, right? So in certain ways, the interests of these writers of the colonial period or the pre-independence period, they kind of conference and overlap at strategic points. To kind of complete this provisional list of names that I have drawn for this purpose, I would also include a couple of other writers who are important to this bibliography of the early 20th century. One is R.L. Spittle, because earlier we spoke about how some of these writers look at caste class concerns. Some of R.L. Spittle's major work, they actually go to the Adivasi or the local Aboriginal communities. One of the most notable, and this is a convenient example, is Spittle's Vanished Trails. So he goes to the Vedda community, the Adivasi community, immersing himself in their culture and trying to understand life through that cultural lens and frame provided. And two other writers, one of them very hot in scholarship even today, but whom I cannot consider as a Sri Lankan writer in spite of his deep connection with Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as the country was called during his stay on the island. Leonard Wolff, famously connected with the Bloomsbury Circle, spouse to Virginia Woolf, because Leonard, based on his Ceylonese experience, he wrote a novel, the village in the jungle, which has never been out of print as far as I know, and which is still of interest to writers, to scholars who deal with various aspects of colonial culture. Leonard Wolff is in many ways for me a cousin of E.M. Foster. The way Foster looks at colonial occupation, colonial culture, the way he positions himself within empire, between that and how Wolff reacts to the same kind of tensions and anxieties, I see a similarity. And also, I'm of the belief Leonard Wolff to this day is a much misunderstood writer within academic circles, at least in Sri Lanka, regarding his response to the people of the island as a whole. Taking off from Wolff, another name that comes to mind is John Still, who was once again deeply immersed in the Sri Lankan people, Sri Lankan landscape, who try to understand the way the culture works at the ground level, which is definitely reflected in his posthumously published novel Jungle Tide in 1931. So these are some of those writers that constitute the first phase of Sri Lanka's English literary tradition. Here I am looking predominantly at people who have been active in the fictional form of writing, but there are also at least two poets I would like to include to make this list look a bit more complete. One poet is definitely W.S. Senior, and scholarship on Senior is very widespread because Senior, he comes from Britain, but his first appointment is in Ceylon, and he spends more than half his life here in Ceylon. And he is someone who was very much a part of the Anglican education establishment here. He worked. He had a very fruitful career at Trinity College in Kandy, and I make the exception of including uh, senior within this canon because of the deep understanding that he brings into his writing of the people of the soil. So, Senior's poetry, in particular, his later poetry, it kind of presents him beyond a simple colonial schoolmaster, but as someone who has, over time, grown an organic relationship with the people, the culture, and the natural landscape of the country. And of course, the second poet I would like to include here is a little acknowledged historian slash educationist, Louis Edmond Blazé. Louis Blazé had his own school, Kingswood School, it was called at that point. Now it's called Kingswood College. A school within which he tried to kind of develop his own literary tradition among its students. And Blazé was famous for publishing a poem every year which was meant for public recital at the school's prize day. This is generally known as the Kingswood Prologue, which Blazé composed continuously without a break from 1895 to 1951, the year of his death. So this is the first category, the first movement of Ceylonese writers. The second movement for me in identifying the Sri Lankan English literary tradition starts from the mid 1950s and goes until the mid 1990s. So it's like a 40-year period, and this is also the period immediately after independence, the post-independence period. So there are also the 1950s, the 1960s, and part of the 70s. It's more concerned with grooming, or it's more concerned with resurrecting home languages and home cultures. So English, which was the dominant language, the dominant access point to culture for over 150 years, it is sidelined, it is on the go. And there is a lot of resurgence, cultural resurgence, not very dissimilar to similar patterns we identify in countries in Africa, the Caribbean, and so on, that take toll on local lifestyle, where to write in English is not exactly the fashionable thing around the time. But this being said, there are some writers, once again a small close-knit group, but definitely people who have been practicing their writing quite consistently and with vigor, who carry the torch of English writing through the 60s and 70s to the 1980s. So I think in this segment of this sharing, I would like to kind of outline some of the names and moments of the writers who were active during this time against the rising tides of post-independence nationalism. There are at least three names that comes to mind when you consider the 1960s, 70s, and the first part of the 1980s. Three names that were predominant within the genre of fiction, and the big name here is the name of James Gunavardhana, who was born in 1921, born in Pannala, brought up in Matara, who published a half a dozen novels between 1968 and the early 1990s. So James Gunavardhana. For me, his more notable works include some of his early fiction. Once again, I would say Gunavardhana is a misunderstood writer by some of the critics and academics of the country, um, because, and this is largely in relation to his early work, like A Quiet Place, published in 1968, The Call of the Kerala, published in 1972, and to a lesser degree, his very famous collection of short stories, The Awakening of Dr. Kirti and Other Stories, published in 1976. The misunderstanding is that some of these critics, some of these scholars try to shut Gunavardhana out, calling him a writer who writes of romantic, idyllic landscapes, who is an escapist in that sense, who kind of breaks away from ground reality, tries to lock himself up in exotic landscapes, which I think is a trivialization at best, a gross misunderstanding, a misunderstanding which I myself had subscribed to as a student, as a young scholar of literature growing up. I think what Gunavardhana does through A Quiet Place, Call of the Kerala, etc., is propose an alternative universe to the hectic, rat race we find in the town or the metropolis. An alternative universe and a minimalist lifestyle, which is not very unobvious in some of the Sinhala literature that was being published around him at the time. One notable name that comes to mind is K. Jayatilaka. K. Jayatilaka's early fiction, especially what he was writing in the 1960s. Books like Charita Tunak, for example, or Pitamaha, Kale Ayante. Kale Ayante, Pitamaha, Charita Tunak, but taken together, they are always turned away from the metropolitan lifestyle, trying to find self-sufficiency within the village, and also minimalism in favor of expansive consumerism. So I have, in my assessment, James Gunavardhana's early work fit into that kind of constellation of writers, where K. Jayatilaka and to a certain degree Jayatilaka's good friend Mahagama Sekara also fits in. Some of Gunavardhana's later work include An Asian Gambit, published in the early 1980s, and also One Mad Bid for Freedom, published in 1990, which once again, as a novel, brings into the fore various concerns to do with minimalism and also to do with the ecology, eco-concerned aspects, which he kind of gives prominence to. So especially some of these aspects come together, some of these discussion points come together to highlight the degree to which Gunavardhana is misunderstood as a writer, especially in these times of climate change, climate debates, and also pandemics, for example, which some people try to trace back to our own consumer patterns. So Gunavardhana, all in all, who, according to Jean Arasanagam, who makes this claim in an interview given to Minoli Salgado in 2007, claims that Gunavardhana died a broken man because he wasn't given the recognition which he probably expected during his lifetime. I would say is very much up for grabs for reassessment in this time than any other previous time period. So along with Gunavardhana, there are two other writers, Punyakanthi Vijayanayaka definitely, who has been consistently publishing from the mid 60s to the 2000 to about 2010. Her Waiting Earth, the Waiting Earth, set in the dry zone, a rural agrarian community, being her debut in 1966. Her more famous novels, her call for fame being Giraya, which she published in 1971, which was also later televised as a series by Lester James Pearis in the early 1990s, and several other works which I consider as being among her prominent work, including Amulet, uh, An Enemy Within, and When Guns Fall Silent. So that is Punyakanthi Vijayanayaka, one of the big three. The third being Raja Proctor. Proctor's more notable work, published in the 60s and 70s, the 50s and the 70s, include The Illicit Immigrant, The Fisherman's Daughter. The Fisherman's Daughter was also, I think, much later turned into a film, a Sinhalese film under the title Divari Geeta, and Raja Proctor's 1973 novel Waiting for Surabiyal. So Proctor, I think, is very conscious of class, the historical understanding of class and class relations in his work. Then, speaking of the 60s and the 80s, there are also some trends and tendencies I would like to bring in addition to the point I made about Gunavardhana, his insistence or his energy in understanding an alternative approach to life, an alternative space within which life can be played out. There was also this sense of the English writing tradition taking off from an emerging sense of post-independence nationalism of especially the 1950s. There is either a pretension or an effort to identify the writing with the writing as well as the concerns that come into that writing within a new national identity, which very often got played out in terms of cultural and linguistic bearings that came into the works of fiction. A kind of a very decisive and weighed down portrayal of aspects that were local. So these can be seen in common to most of these works that I cited earlier. There are two poets that are important to me who represent the 1950s and the 1960s. One is Patrick Fernando, whom I can actually quote in order to identify that interest with aspects local within an emerging new identity of post-independence. Patrick Fernando is now, he comes from a classics background, he's a classics scholar. But if you take his poetry, there is a very good balance between a classical idiom that deals with classical themes, as well as the use of that classical honing, his classical sensibility of literature, into the discussion of themes that are local. Now, I think the more common or the more convenient example is his very famous poem, A Fisherman Mourned by His Wife, which is one of several poems that very decisively, centrally deal with local aspects. But if you take the craftsmanship, the actual finish of the poem, it has a very strong reverberance, a very strong echo of a classically honed poetic sensibility. Then, of course, the guy I consider the most important poet Sri Lanka has produced post-independence, Lakdas Wickramasinghe. Wickramasinghe, whose writing can be understood or can be accessed from three different points. One, as poetry that is deeply political and social conscious, and then secondly, a second tier of his writing, poetry that produces a very strong anti-colonial vibe. In classrooms, the most widely quoted poem of this anti-colonial department is the poem titled Don't Talk to Me About Matisse. But also I have to insert a footnote here because my friend Anne-Marie De Silva wrote a paper a few years ago in which she challenges this claim that the poem Don't Talk to Me About Matisse has anything to do with colonialism. But the conventional or the widespread view is that this is a very deeply anti-colonial poem, and my own conviction also lies there, in spite of my respect and deference to Anne-Marie. The third area in which Lakdas Wickramasinghe becomes important is how he tries to forge a new poetic idiom which breaks away from, the British norm and tries to kind of use the linguistic resonances that are more familiar to local audiences as the building blocks of that idiom. So these are very much, this is very much prevalent in some of his linguistic play in poems like The Coconuts, from the life of the folk poet, from the life of the folk poet Yisinho, and also The Cobra. His shorter poems, which are almost like theater spaces that he used to play out the linguistic experiment that he's carrying out. And of course, coming to the 80s, another brigade of poets become prominent in the Sri Lankan tradition. People like G. Narasanayagam, Anne Ranasinghe, and also Richard de Souza. Their poetry very much immersed in the political landscape, the political realities of that time. And if you take once again the novel, there's a writer I have to mention, writer Sita Kulatunga, who first emerged in the second half of the 1980s, went on to publish a couple of novels, but none of them as popular or as widely circulated as her debut, Dari, the Third Wife, published twice, initially in 1988 and then in 1992, in which Sita Kulatunga, this very I would say uncharacteristic of the Sri Lankan tradition from the 60s to the early 90s, which were more located within the geographic cultural space of the nation, whereas Kulatunga bases her novel in Nigeria. So it is set in Nigeria, it deals with the Nigerian context, the third wife being and kind of an access to polygamy that was practiced in the northern part of Nigeria at the time. So she kind of makes an odd but very crucial inclusion in this body of writers. The third phase of Sri Lankan English writing comes the 1990s, more specifically the early to mid 1990s onwards. So here, what I take as a kind of a marker to set the 90s apart from its preceding generations is the emergence of a new publication boom to do with the offset printing and the involvement of international publishers, more and more international publishers in publishing local talent, or at the least writers with a Sri Lankan heritage. So definitely names like Romesh Gunasekara, Shyam, Selvadure come to mind. And with they are being published overseas along with other writers. Sri Lanka comes within easy reach of transnational publishers. That kind of opens out the industry and bringing a new generation, which for me is that third phase. Um, so, speaking of 1990s, for me, the kind of milestone or the signpost that introduces a new era is the name of Karl Muller, who, in terms of idiom, in terms of how you write what you write, kind of opens the space for the Sri Lankan idiom to cover an unprecedented ground, uh, where I generally say that Karl Muller is the writer who taught Sri Lankan English fiction to swear, and the swearing happens once every other line. So he's the one who kind of took off Sri Lankan English writing, that veil of lajja, and taught it to speak in direct, honest, at times offensive terms. So Karl Muller's writing, he started with the jam fruit tree in 1993, and between 1993 and 1998, he published a series of fictional work set around a working class burgher family in suburban Colombo, which came to be known as his Burger Trilogy plus one. The plus one being Spit and Polish, which was published in 1998, once again concerned with the same burger family of the Von Blossers, but set apart from the original trilogy, the Jam Fruit Tree, 1993, Yakadayaka, 1994, and Once Upon a Tender Time, 1995. So that trilogy set apart. Now, the 1990s, along with Karl Muller, was also important, as I hinted briefly earlier, for the emergence of a new expatriate guard, which in the course of the next 10 to 15 years was set to take over Sri Lankan English writing as their own. In other words, in the next 15 years, 10 to 15 years, leading from the early 1990s. So I'm talking about 2000, 2005. By that time, Sri Lankan English writing came to be defined with the expatriate branch as the default. So ownership had changed by that time. The earliest of this new brigade, this emerging new brigade of the expatriate department, came in the guise of writers like Romesh Gunasekara and Shyam Selvadure. So with time, there would be others included in this category, people who would publish at least more than 2 novels, that being the qualifying mark. People like Manuka Vijayasinghe, who is currently German resident, Naomi Munavira. These are the big names of at least this generation of writing that is Sri Lankan. Michelle de Kretser, who left Sri Lanka and settled down in Australia, where she has made a name for herself as a leading writer of the Australian circuit. Writers like Roma Tiani, who published 5 novels in quick succession, mid-2000s to about 2012, between 2006 and 2012, 5 quick novels, most of them with a Sri Lankan concern. Channa Vikramasekara, who is again Melbourne resident, who has published about 5 books, most of them with a Sri Lankan, not most of them, all of them with a Sri Lankan connection. Uh, Rue Freeman, US based, and of course, the name I shouldn't forget, the father of all these Sri Lankan related expatriate writers coming back to Sri Lanka in terms of in search of thematic ground, Michael Ondaatje. So Michael Ondaatje has at least three main work that brings him back to Sri Lanka. Running in the Family 1982, Anil's Ghost 2000, and The Cat's Table 2010. The name that runs the risk of not being mentioned in a kind of casual discussion like this, but which has to be given its due place, is the name of Ambalavanar Sivanandan, or he's known as A. Sivanandan in literary circuits, who in 1998 published When Memory Dies. When Memory Dies is, in my opinion, a very powerful novel that looks at many aspects of changing Sri Lanka across the 20th century from a very informed Marxist perspective. So that is Ambalavanar Sivanandan. Now, these writers emerging in the second half of the 1990s and consolidating their place in the 2000s, they come with several common denominators which we need to list out. One is that they are largely first world published. So these are people who are handled by like internationally powerful publishing houses coming with big budgets. They have wide circulation, very well organized promotional mechanisms, and they are aligned with very powerful brands, which automatically kind of casts out the resident Sri Lankan writers into a disadvantageous nook, or a disadvantageous second tier. So this is very much what happened in terms of how Sri Lankan writing is conveyed to our contemporary moment, where the Sri Lankan, the resident Sri Lankan writer has to struggle with publishers who are inept in their trade, booksellers who are very bad at selling, and writerly readerly culture which is stunted for reasons I will go into in about 2 or 3 minutes. And today, the Sri Lankan writing happens in a context that is defined by where the definition, or where the default is actually the expatriate writer and the standard set by the expatriate writer. Local writers in the 90s and 2000s, in spite of this growing parity, there are quite a few who have held their fort, been true to their craft, committed, and produced literature that has somehow emerged and stood shoulder to shoulder with the international brethren, the international cousins. So the leading name of this category is Karl Muller, definitely. Even his later work, which in many aspects for me do not live up to the same punch as his original work, the Burger trilogy and Spit and Polish, are still of a caliber, a class that can rank among some of the best work to emerge from Sri Lanka. So definitely a very ambitious book he puts out in 2000, The Children of the Lion, with its 3 subsequent sequels. The sequels to me are in many ways anticlimactic, but definitely The Children of the Lion, that's a very, very ambitious retelling of the Mahavamsa tradition, but not necessarily original as an approach, because there are so many retellings of this sort, especially coming from South Asia. R.K. Narayan has a very famous retelling of the Mahabharata. Then we have a similar venture by Shashi Tharoor, So I think these are very much within that same neighborhood of literary ventures. But Karl Muller's is a mammoth concentrated effort, and also very ambiguous and mischievous. Because my personal belief is that Children of the Lion is very tongue-in-cheek, looking back at a history which is fetishized and valorized by a myopic post-independence nationalism. He's looking at it in a very tongue-in-cheek way, in a very mischievous way. And this is something for which he actually got the State Literary Award, which would make it even more satisfying, I'm sure. Then there are writers like Ashok Ferry. Ashok Ferry, well, not my, I would say my most favorite cup of tea, but someone who has still been consistent to the craft he believes in, and been consistent in the bookshelves from 2004 to the present moment. Writers like Amin Hussain once again, and Ayadure Santhan, whom I kind of rank among the best writers in terms of his commitment to society through his writing. Because Santhan, between 2009 and the present, has undertaken among himself the task of filling some of the gaps left in dominant narratives dealing with Sri Lanka in its conflict zone. So, for example, in The Whirlwind, published in 2009, Santhan looks at what really happened when the IPKF, or the Indian Peacekeeping Force, came to the northern villages in the country. And once again, in his novel Rails Run Parallel, published in 2015, Santhan is looking at 1977 and 1979, two incidents of violence targeting the Tamil community that goes underrepresented in literary traditions of all languages in Sri Lanka. So there are so many writers writing about 1983, but not so much, conflict moments on the run-up to 1983, like 77, 79, or 1981. And definitely Shehan Karunatilaka, though he has only published 2 novels to date, his Chinaman, published in 2010, is one of the defining moments. Once again, a triumph for, I would say, idiom, in terms of how you kind of broad base the idiomatic scope, the idiomatic space for creative expression, Chinaman. And in the same way, in terms of poetry, writers like Malinda Seneviratne and Vivi Marie Vanderputten. Vanderputten has published 3 collections of poetry. She seems to publish once every 5 years, starting in 2007, 2012, and 2017. And Malinda Seneviratne, who seems to be a bit silent these days, but he had this phase where he was malarial in his writing, especially between 2010 and 2014. And he's also the only writer to have won both the Gratian Prize and the H.I. Gunatilaka Prize. He's a brilliant translator as well. So this brings us to the present, and the present is actually the starting point for the lecture series in mind. These historical surveys being just a kind of a rite of passage, a way of getting there. And the present moment, there are several kind of pointers I want to raise as a way of concluding this particular movement. One is to identify where the Sri Lankan English writer is at present. So when I take to Sri Lankan writing in its present form, and as I have also hinted in this segment, there are 2 departments that come within my purview. One is the resident writer, the writer who is resident living in Sri Lanka, and the expatriate, the non-resident. That's what I call them. I look at it in relation to the resident. So the expatriate for me would be the non-resident writer. And the kind of conditions that surround the resident writer. So for instance, a virtue of what I have discussed in the course of this delivery, the resident writer has today become a subspecies within his own jungle, his or her own jungle, because the Sri Lankan English literary tradition is now defined in relation to the non-resident writer as the default. The reason being they are closer to the first world, they are published by, the reason being capitalism and how capitalism factors in the publishing industry. And also secondarily because the Sri Lankan Academy has played into the hands of the big business capitalist publishing market. The Sri Lankan Academy, for some reason, this is probably a psychological reason, it's probably how you fetishize, big names, big writers. They have prioritized, consciously or otherwise, what comes into Sri Lanka as Sri Lankan culture in production form from the outside, while increasingly marginalized whatever literature that gets produced within the country. So the favor of the Sri Lankan Academy has shifted from grooming a local literature, either in terms of encouraging it or giving it guidance, to appreciating what comes from outside, to which the local writer is assigned a fiddle or a secondary role. So there's very much scope right now in 2020 for a fight back or a charge back, a revival or resurrection of the resident writer, to which the resident writer communities have to take a serious interest, because the academy has let them down, the publishers have let them down, conventional hidebound publishers who have no clue how to kind of broad base a market that features Sri Lankan writers. The critical culture has died because the university is no longer interested in that kind of critical culture or contributing to a critical. The newspapers are not anymore interested in that kind of advent. There are poor sales, poor reviews, and very little platforms for the local, the resident writers. But as a boon for them, we are emerging a new phase of e-publications and electronically maneuvered spaces and platforms of literature. So it is up to their energy, to their commitment and concern, to manipulate, to best use these spaces that give you wider coverage and wider access to various tiers of literary production and consumption, and to stage a fight back to gain what should be their rightful ground.